My name is Tessa Hill, and I am 33 years old. My grandfather left each of his grandchildren $1,000 in his will. There were 9 of us. The math is not hard. $9,000. 3 days after we buried him, I pulled his bank records, and $312,000 had walked out the door in his last 18 months. My grandmother said it all went to his medicine. I keep books for a living, so I checked the insurance first. His plan covered every cent down to the parking at the cancer center. 90 days later, 4 couples would stand in my grandmother's kitchen, and 3 of those marriages would not leave that room whole. I didn't plan any of it. I just couldn't make a wrong number sit still. Welcome back to Revenge Drama Stories 1. Quiet stories about ordinary people, hard arithmetic, and the moment the truth finally gets read out loud. If a family ever told you that you cared too much about the facts, that you should let it go, that you were the difficult one, then settle in because this story is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe before the numbers start adding up. We buried Walter Hill on a gray Thursday in a town called Garrett, Ohio, where he had fixed machines for 40 years. The church was full. My grandfather had been a tool and die man, the kind who measured twice and trusted no one's numbers but his own. Snorts. 9 grandchildren sat in the first 3 pews. My grandmother, Maureen, sat at the center of all of it, accepting hands like a woman receiving tribute. My branch sat near the back. My father was Walt's son, and he died 6 years ago. So, our side had drifted to the edges, the way grief makes families drift. I noticed who sat close to Gram and who didn't. I always noticed things like that. For years, I'd been the one who kept the family's books, the reunion fund, the headstone collection, my aunt's little quilt business when her hands got bad. Nobody paid me. They just handed me the math and looked away. And somewhere in there, I became the cold one, the difficult one, the niece who asked for receipts. At the lunch-on, Gram caught my hand and held it longer than I expected. "You were always the one counting," she said, and she smiled when she said it, but the smile didn't reach the rest of her face. Then she said something that stuck a small hook in me. She wanted the estate settled fast before everyone scatters. Walt had been gone 72 hours. The will hadn't even been read. I told myself grief made people want clean endings. I almost believed it, but my grandmother had never once in her life wanted anything done fast. And the part of me that keeps ledgers filed that away under a column I didn't have a name for yet. The will was read 4 days later in the office of Howard Marsh, the estate attorney, a careful man with a careful desk. He read it plainly. Each grandchild would receive $1,000. The house would go to Maureen. Everything left over, the residue would go to Maureen too. Then he paused. And the pause is the thing I remember. "I have to be candid," he said. "The liquid estate is light." Someone asked what light meant. Marsh looked at his page. "There is roughly $14,000 in the accounts." The room went quiet in a way that had texture to it. 9. 1,000 is 9,2,000. There was 14. My grandfather had spent his whole life refusing to waste a dollar. He reused coffee filters for heaven's sake, and he had retired with real money. I knew because I'd helped him roll an old pension years back. My Uncle Dale, Gram's son, and the named executive cleared his throat. Dad's care was expensive at the end. He said, "Cancer isn't cheap." I asked the only question a bookkeeper can't help asking. Didn't his insurance cover the treatment? Dale's jaw tightened. "We're not doing this here, Tessa." Gram reached over and patted his arm, calm as Sunday. "I let it go in the room because you don't fight at a will reading." But before I left, I asked Marsh how a beneficiary requests the account statements. He told me I had a right to an accounting. He said it gently, the way you hand someone a tool they're about to need. I drove home with $14,000 sitting in my chest like a stone. I wasn't angry yet. I was just a person who'd been handed a sum that didn't reconcile. And I have never in my life been able to leave one of those alone. That night, I built a spreadsheet because that's what I do when the world stops making sense. I knew most of his numbers. Walt's pension, his Social Security, the small annuity I'd helped him set up. Call it $4,100 a month coming in, steady as a clock. His house was paid off in 2009. His truck was a 2004 he refused to replace. The man's biggest indulgence was a fishing license and a chocolate bar on Fridays. By any honest count, he should have been adding to his savings every single month, even with a long illness, because the insurance was good and the supplement was better. I had helped him pick that supplement plan myself 3 years back at his kitchen table. Instead, the accounts had bled out. So, Monday morning, I called the bank where he'd kept his main savings for 30 years. I told the woman I was a beneficiary and that the attorney had advised me to request statements. She was kind. She pulled the last 18 months. And then she got quiet, and I heard pages, and she said, "There are a lot of cashier checks on here." I asked how many and how big. She read me a few. 45,000, 38,000, 3,000. My pen stopped moving. Cashier's checks are what people use when they don't want a paper trail leading anywhere personal. No account number on the other end, just a bank's promise turned into cash you can hand across a table. My grandfather, the man who logged every gallon of gas in a little date book, had been writing checks the size of a year's salary over and over while he was too sick to drive himself to the bank. By Tuesday, I hadn't slept. I had a list of dates instead. I went to see Graham on a Wednesday, the way you'd go to a doctor for a lump, hoping there is a simple answer, knowing there might not be. Her kitchen smelled like the same coffee it had smelled like my whole life. She poured me a cup and asked about my job and my apartment and whether I was eating for 10 minutes. It was warm, and I let it be warm because part of me wanted the warm version of this to be the true one. Then I set my list of dates on the table gently like it was something that could break. "Graham, I said there's a lot of money missing from Grandpa's accounts. I'm just trying to understand where it went." She didn't even look at the page. "It all went to his medicine, Tessa." She said it flat. Finished. A door closing. I said the insurance had covered his treatment. I'd checked. The warmth went out of her face like a pilot light snuffed. "You were always the one counting," she said. And this time it wasn't a compliment at all. Brett was there leaning in the doorway. My cousin Brett, 34, who'd bought a house last year and called it a steal. He pushed off the frame. "Family doesn't audit family tests," he said, smiling the way salesmen smile. "Let the man rest." I picked up my list. I didn't raise my voice. I have never been a yeller. My anger goes cold and quiet and starts looking for documents. "I'm not auditing anyone," I said. "I'm trying to add it up." Graham walked me to the door with a hand on my back, all softness again. And the softness scared me more than the cold had. "Let it go, sweetheart," she said. I drove home with "Let It Go" ringing in my ears like a struck glass. The whisper campaign started before I'd even reached my own driveway. By the time I got home, the family group chat had 30 new messages. Brett's wife, Sloane, had set the tone. Sloane is 31 and treats every conversation like a courtroom she's already won. Grief makes people imagine things. She wrote, "Some of us are just sad, not suspicious." Then the kicker dressed up as concern. "Tessa's probably just upset she only got the same 10 grand as everyone else." A couple of cousins sent hearts. My aunt sent a praying hands. I watched my own family quietly agree that I was the problem, and I felt the old familiar pull to apologize for caring about the truth. I didn't. Instead, I did the thing I know how to do. I logged into my grandfather's insurance portal. He'd given me his login years ago to help with claims, and I pulled every explanation of benefits from his last 18 months. EOBS are boring documents that tell the whole story if you let them. Line after line, the same beautiful word in the patient responsibility column. 000. His chemo, his scans, his hospital stays, all of it billed, all of it paid. The man owed almost nothing out of pocket. The supplement plan I'd picked at his kitchen table had done exactly what I built it to do. So, it all went to his medicine. Wasn't a sad truth I'd been too cold to accept. It was a sentence with a hole in it, and the hole was $3,000 wide. I printed all of it and put it in a folder. I still didn't know where the money went, but I finally knew where it hadn't. And that turned a vague unease into a question with edges. Somebody had moved that money on purpose. I tried to do it the polite way first, the slow way, the way that keeps families whole. I called Marsh and formally requested the full account history through the estate. 2 days later, Dale called me, and his voice had a new hardness in it. "Mom's accounts are private," he said. "You're not entitled to go digging through her personal finances." I told him I was asking about Grandpa's accounts, the ones funding 9 bequests that didn't exist anymore. That's when I learned the thing that changed how I understood all of it. The big savings, the 30-year account, the money market were joint accounts. Walton Morin, both names, either signature, which meant that for 18 months, while my grandfather forgot what year it was, my grandmother could move every dollar with a single signature, and nobody at the bank would blink. I had wondered near the end whether someone should be watching his money. I'd even floated once gently, and Graham had told me he'd be insulted, that he'd handled his own affairs his whole life. I'd backed off because you can't freeze a man's accounts on a feeling, and because legally I was nobody. Not his POA, not a signer, just the grandkid who was good with numbers. The structure was built to let exactly this happen, and by the time I could see it clearly, the man it protected was already in the ground. That's the part I want you to understand. I wasn't asleep. I asked the questions. I just didn't have the keys. And the people who did had every reason to keep the door shut. So, I stopped asking nicely. I went home, opened my laptop, and searched for the only kind of person who could open a door like this, a forensic accountant. There was exactly one within 3 counties. Her name was Nayen Puit, and her office was above a dry cleaner, which somehow made me trust her more. She was about 60 with reading glasses on a chain and the unbothered calm of someone who has watched money lie for a living. CPA and certified fraud examiner. 22 years of it, mostly divorces and estates and the occasional embezzling church treasurer. I laid out what I had. The 14,000, the 90 that should have been there, the cashier's checks, the zeroed out EOBS. She listened without interrupting, which is its own kind of professionalism. When I finished, she didn't promise me anything, and that's exactly why I believed her. "Here's what I can tell you," she said. "Pulling the records is the easy part. Relatively, proving something is the hard part." She explained it plainly. Anyone can move money. To do anything about it, we'd need 3 things to line up. A pattern in the withdrawals, evidence that your grandfather couldn't fully understand or consent at the time, and the fact that the person moving the money stood in a position of trust over his finances. In Snorts, Ohio, she said, if all 3 hold, the picture changes. Gifts can be challenged, the burden can shift, but none of that is automatic, and none of it is fast. I asked what she needed from me. Authorizations, his medical records, patience, and a stomach for what we find. I signed everything on her desk that afternoon. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't felt since the will reading. Not triumph, nothing that clean, just the relief of finally being pointed in a direction. I had spent 2 weeks being told I was paranoid. Now, a professional was telling me the records would either clear everyone or condemn somebody. And either way, I'd finally know. Getting the records was not a montage. It was 3 weeks of forms. As a named beneficiary, I had a right to an accounting, and with Marcia's help that gave me standing to request the estate's banking history. But each institution had its own ritual. 2 banks cooperated within days. A third dragged its feet, citing the joint account holder's privacy. And Nadine had to escalate through the estate's authority before they'd release anything. Every delay felt like watching a clock you can't reach. While the paper crawled toward us, the family pressure changed shape. It got softer, and softer is harder to fight. My cousin Dana showed up at my apartment one evening with a casserole and wet eyes. Dana is 30, gentle, the cousin who remembers birthdays. She sat at my little table and begged me, "Please stop, Tessa. You're scaring Graham. She's 78. She cries about it." I told her I didn't want to scare anyone. I just wanted the math to make sense. And that's when I noticed something off. Donna wasn't pleading for Graham. Not really. Underneath the worry, she was scared for herself. Her hands shook around the coffee mug. She kept asking what the accountant had found, not whether I'd drop it. People who have nothing to hide ask you to stop because of the family. People who have something to hide ask you what you know. I hugged her at the door and told her it would be okay. And I watched her hurry to her car like she was leaving a fire. I didn't understand it yet. I just filed it. Another entry in a ledger I was keeping in my head. The one labeled, "This is bigger than I thought." 2 days later, Nadine called. The last bank had folded. We had 18 months of statements. "Come in," she said. "You'll want to be sitting down." The statements covered Nyen's table edge to edge, and she had already gone through them with a highlighter the color of a warning sign. "I added the cashier's checks first," she said. "Just those? Just the big clean ones cut to outside parties?" She slid a tape across to me. The total at the bottom was $222,000. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't inventing a zero. $222,000 in cashier's checks over 18 months drawn off a dying man's joint savings. The rest of the missing money, the gap up to $312, had drained more quietly into Graham's own new accounts, and a fresh annuity in her name alone, which was its own kind of story. But the cashier's checks were the loud part. Those were deliberate. Those were money turned into something handable, something you could give a person without leaving your fingerprints on their bank statement. "So much for his medicine," I said. And Nadine didn't smile, but something flickered behind her glasses. "Here's our problem," she said. "A cashier's check doesn't name the person who cashes it. We know the money left. We don't yet know where it landed." She tapped the stack. "But every one of these gets deposited somewhere, and deposits leave a backside. Endorsements, account numbers, the bank's own routing. We subpoena the paid items. We read the backs. We follow each one home. It would take time and cost money. My money, the same $1,000 Walt had left me, which felt like exactly the right use for it. I told her to do it. "You sure?" she asked. "Once we know, you can't unknow." I was already sure. I'd been sure since the word zero appeared 300 times in a column. The first one came back 10 days later, and it was the biggest. $45,000 cut 14 months ago, deposited and then wired straight to a mortgage company in Dayton. Nayan had the loan reference. I didn't even need her to say the name. I already knew because I'd sat at a barbecue last summer and listened to Brett explain his miracle house. The 4-bedroom on linen, the one with the deck, the one he got because a seller got desperate and did a little owner financing. You wouldn't believe the deal. There was no desperate seller. There was a cashier's check from his grandfather's dying account, $45,000, landing as his down payment 3 days before he closed. I sat with that. I want to be honest about what it felt like because I think you felt some version of it. It wasn't rage. Not at first. It was a kind of grief with a sharp edge. The understanding that while I was driving Walt to a scan because nobody else would, my cousin was cashing his savings into granite countertops. And the smiling? That's what got me. The barbecue, the wouldn't believe the deal, the whole performance of having earned something told to a table that included the man's own bank account. Nadine watched my face. "There will be more," she said, not unkindly. "Patterns don't usually run to one." She was right. The endorsements kept coming back, one paid item at a time, like a slow tide, bringing things to shore. I started a clean spreadsheet because, of course, I did. Date, amount, where it landed, whose celebration it paid for. I told myself I was just keeping records. But somewhere in there, it stopped being a question of where the money went and started being a list of names. I needed to know how many. By the end of the month, the spreadsheet had names in nearly every row. Ryan, my cousin, $29,000 to $38,000, traced to a jeweler and then a wedding venue and then a small loan payoff. Ryan, who'd gotten engaged last spring and proposed with a ring that made the cousins gasp, who'd told everyone his consulting thing was finally taking off. His consulting thing was Walt. Kayla, 36, $3,000, routed as 3 tidy consulting payments into her husband Tom's auto shop, which had been one bad winter from closing and then suddenly wasn't. Dana, $4,000, deposited into a savings account, and then, I'd later learn, described to her own husband as the maturing of a CD that never existed. Each amount was different, but the shape was identical. And when I lined the recipients up against one fact, the whole thing finally made a terrible kind of sense. The cousins who got money were the cousins who came around. Brett drove Graham to church. Ryan mowed her lawn. Kayla called every Sunday. Dana brought groceries, my branch, my late father's kids. We drifted after Dad died, the way I told you. And we got nothing extra. Not because we were hated, but because we weren't there. It wasn't a golden child and a scapegoat. It was simpler and colder than that. It was attendance. My grandmother had been paying out my grandfather's money like a frequent visitor program, and the prize was a dying man's savings. I sat in Nyan's office and felt the last of my politeness leave my body. Not as a scream, as a settling. We have the where, I said. Now I want the when. Nyan looked at me for a long moment. Then she pulled a single blank sheet from her printer tray and reached for a pen. What Nyan handed me an hour later was one page, just one. On the left, every cashier's check by date. On the right, what was happening in our family that same week. She had built it without my prompting because she had seen this shape before and she wanted me to see it clean. I read it from the top and the room got very quiet the way the will reading had, except this time I was the only one in it. Brett's $45,000 cut 3 days before his house closing. Ryan's $38,000 cut the same week he proposed. The check practically wet when he got down on one knee. Kayla's $3,000 dated the Monday after Tom's shop got its final notice. Dana's $4,000 drawn 2 days before the invoice from her fertility clinic. On and on, each withdrawal sitting 3 or 4 days ahead of a celebration, like a man clearing his throat before someone else gets to speak. And the line that put a hand around my heart was the one Nadine said out loud quietly, almost to herself. He was dying, she said, and the checks kept time with their parties. I looked at the dates of his scans. I had those too, and I saw it. The withdrawals clustered around his worst weeks. The sicker he got, the more freely the money moved because the sicker he got, the less he could ask where it was going. I took out my phone and photographed that page, and I have looked at it more times than I can count since. People think the turning point in a story like this is the big confrontation. It isn't. The turning point is one quiet sheet of paper on a folding table above a dry cleaner. The moment the loss stops being a number and becomes a calendar. His decline on one axis, their good news on the other. Perfectly obscenely in step. I folded it into my folder. I didn't let it out of my sight again. The page told me what happened. It didn't yet prove anyone did anything they could be held to. For that, Nyan said, we needed his mind on the record. So, I requested Walt's medical files for those same 18 months, which I could do as the estate worked through Marsh with the right authorizations. They came in a thick envelope, and I read every page at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. The picture they painted was its own quiet heartbreak. 14 months before he died, my grandfather had a small stroke. A TIA, the note said with residual confusion. After that, the words started repeating in his charts. Disoriented to date, poor short-term recall. Requires assistance with financial and medical decisions. There was a neurologist note, plain as a fence post. Patient no longer able to manage complex affairs independently. I read that line and I thought about the cashier's checks cut in those exact months, 45,000 at a time, and I understood that the man signing them, if he signed them at all, may not have known what day it was, let alone what he was giving away. I brought the records to Nadine. She read them the way she read everything, slowly, then set them down. This is the piece, she said. In Ohio, a gift needs a giver who understood it. The bigger the gift, the clearer his head had to be. These notes say his head wasn't clear. She was careful, though. She kept saying could and may and a court would have to find. Nothing's automatic, she warned me. But your grandmother handled his money and stood in a position of trust. If this goes anywhere, the people who took these gifts may have to prove he meant them. That's a hard thing to prove about a man who couldn't name the year. For the first time, I wasn't just holding a grievance. I was holding a lever. You can feel a family close ranks. It's a temperature change. Within a week of me requesting those medical records, Uncle Dale called a family meeting at Graham's house, and I was summoned to it like a defendant. I went because running from it would have meant they got to write the story without me. 11 of them in the living room and me in the chair by the door. Dale ran it like a foreman. "We are not going to drag a 78-year-old woman through a courtroom," he announced over money that was hers to begin with. He talked about legacy and grief and moving on. He asked me in front of everyone whether I really wanted to be the person who put my grandmother on a witness stand. Brett supplied the chorus from the couch. "Family doesn't audit family," he said again, like a man who'd found the one sentence that worked. I stayed quiet and let them talk because I've learned that the calm person in a loud room ends up holding the most cards. But Dale made one mistake. The kind people make when they think they've already won. Defending Graham, he waved a hand and said, "I'm the one who handled all the paperwork on those accounts, so I'd know." The room didn't catch it. I did. The executive, the man legally in charge of accounting for the estate, had just told 11 witnesses that he personally handled the paperwork on the very transfers I was tracing. I wrote it down in my phone the second I got to my car, word for word, with the date. I drove home steadier than I had felt in weeks. They thought the meeting was where they'd shut me down. It was actually where one of them handed me a thread, and I had spent my whole life pulling threads until things came apart cleanly. I know some of you are talking to your screen right now, telling me to walk away, that no inheritance is worth a war with your own grandmother. I almost did walk away, but my grandfather kept clean books for 40 years, and somebody emptied them while he couldn't see straight, and then told the whole family I was the cold one for noticing. If you've ever been the person who cared too much about the truth and got punished for it, stay with me. Comment the word count so I know you're still here, and let's keep going because Sloane wasn't done when the family meeting didn't break me. She changed the target. She started telling the extended relatives that I was really after the house, that this was about me wanting Graham's home, that grief had made me greedy. She was good at it. By the next week, 2 aunts who'd known me since birth were giving me the careful voice you use with someone unstable. Then Sloane overplayed it. She tried to get me uninvited from the estate's final settlement meeting, the 90-day sit-down where Marsh would close everything out and everyone would sign off. She told people it would upset Graham to have me there. But here's the thing about being the cold, difficult, by-the-book one. I knew my rights. As a named beneficiary, I had every right to be there when the estate's accounting was reviewed and signed off. And Marsh confirmed it in a 2-line email I saved. Sloane could rewrite my reputation all she wanted. She couldn't rewrite the probate code, so I let her talk, and I made my decision. And it was a quiet one. I wasn't going to send letters and demands from a distance. I was going to bring everything I'd found to that settlement table in person with the spouses in the room. Let it be read out loud. I want to be clear about something because it matters to me and it should matter to you. I did not plan an ambush. An ambush is what they kept accusing me of, and it would have been the easy, satisfying, wrong thing to do. Instead, Nyan and Marsh and I built it the slow, boring, unkillable way through process. First, Marsh filed an objection to closing the estate, a formal hold, so Dale couldn't quietly finalize everything before the truth surfaced. Second, because the record suggested an elderly man's money had been moved while he was impaired, we reported it to Adult Protective Services. Marsh was careful with me about that. It's a referral, not a verdict, a request for the people whose job it is to look. Third, I sent Dale a formal demand for a full accounting certified mail, the kind of letter that exists forever. None of it was loud. All of it was on paper. That's the difference between the people in this story and me. And it's the whole point. Their weapons were the soft ones. A lie at a kitchen table, a rumor in a group chat, a guilt trip about a grandmother's age. My weapons were the dull ones. Statements, endorsements, a neurologist note, a demand letter with a tracking number. You cannot cry your way out of a certified accounting. You cannot spin a deposit slip. Dale's lawyer wrote back within the week, and the letter was almost funny in its confidence. My grandmother, it said, looked forward to explaining everything at the settlement meeting. They thought the meeting would be their stage. They had no idea I'd be bringing the script. I spent that weekend not rehearsing a speech, but organizing a binder, because a speech can be rattled, and a binder just sits there being true. The first crack didn't come from a document. It came from a phone call I didn't expect. Greg, Dana's husband, called me on a Tuesday night, and his voice was the voice of a man standing on a floor he's just realized might be painted over a hole. "Tessa," he said, "can I ask you something? And will you tell me the truth?" Greg is a decent man, a high school wrestling coach, the kind who shows up early and stays late. He told me he'd been going through their accounts to plan for a baby, and he'd found a $4,000 deposit from a year and a half ago that he had no memory of. He'd asked Dana. Dana told him it was a CD from her grandfather that had finally matured. "But there's no CD on any statement going back," he said. "And now she won't talk about it, and she cries when I bring it up, and I keep hearing your name." He asked me straight out if I knew where that money came from. I had a choice in that moment, and I want you to know I thought about it. I could have handed him everything, lit the fuse myself, watched it go. Instead, I told him the only thing I felt I had the right to say. "I think you should ask Dana directly," I said, "and I think you should ask her to show you the CD because it wasn't mine to detonate." The marriages in this story didn't break because I broke them. They broke because they were already built on money that came with a lie attached. And lies like that don't stay buried. They wait. Greg was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Okay," in a way that meant he already knew. After he hung up, I understood the settlement meeting was going to be worse than I'd planned. Some of these people were about to learn the truth in front of the ones they loved. I went to see Graham one more time before the meeting. I told myself it was to give her a chance. But really, I think I went because I needed to know if there was a person in there I still recognized. She looked smaller in her chair, a quilt over her knees, and for a while we didn't talk about money at all. Then, unprompted, she started talking about her own mother. I'd never heard the story straight through. Her mother had died in a county home 2 counties over in a row of beds, and by the end, nobody visited. 3 weeks, Graham said. Nobody came for 3 weeks. They told me she stopped asking the second week. Her hands worked at the quilt. I swore that would never be me. And then she said the thing I've turned over 100 times since. I just wanted them to come, Tessa. And God help me. I felt it. I saw the frightened girl inside the old woman. The one who decided love was something you had to secure, like a loan with collateral. I almost reached for her hand, but then she looked up and the softness was gone. And she said, "Your grandfather wanted them taken care of. You're twisting a kind man into a crime." And just like that, she was lying again to my face, reaching for the man in the ground to shield the thing she'd done. That's when I understood her completely and stopped being afraid of her. She was not a villain in a cape. She was a terrified woman who had bought her family's attendance with a dying man's savings and told herself it was love. Both things were true. The fear was real. So was the theft. Understanding the first one did not excuse the second. I told her I loved her because I did and that I'd see her at the meeting. Then I drove home and finished the binder. Whatever softness was left between us, Graham burned it down that same week, and she did it the way cornered people do by accusing you of the exact thing they've done. Word started going around that I had been the one taking advantage of Grandpa, that I'd always had his login, that I'd helped with his finances a little too closely. Sloan carried the news story to anyone who'd listen, and now it had a shape. Maybe Tessa was the one who drained him, and all this accountant business was her covering her tracks. It was clever. I'll give them that. It used the truest thing about me, that I was the one who helped him with money and turned it into the knife. For about a day, it scared me. Then I remembered who I am. I am a bookkeeper. I keep records on myself the way I keep them on everyone out of habit and self-pee protection. Every time I'd helped Walt, I documented it. I had emails where he asked me to review a plan. I had the supplement application with my notes in the margin, saving him money, not taking it. I had not received a single dollar from him in my life beyond the 100,000 in the will, and I could prove it down to the penny, which is more than anyone else in that family could say. So, While they spun a story out of suspicion, I built a counterfile out of facts, and I added it to the binder behind its own tab. Their whole strategy depended on the room running on feelings. Mine depended on it running on paper. And I had spent 33 years learning that when the feelings finally burn off, the paper is still sitting there unbothered, saying exactly what it said before anyone started yelling. The meeting was in 4 days. I was ready. Nadine finished the report 2 days before the settlement meeting, and when she handed it to me bound, I felt the weight of it in both hands. It was not a pile of accusations. It was an argument made entirely of facts, which is the only kind that survives a room full of people who hate it. Every cashier's check by date and amount. Every endorsement showing where it landed. The timeline page, the one that kept time with their parties. The medical records with the neurologist's line highlighted. The insurance EOBs 300 deep. Killing the medicine story on contact. She'd even added a one-page summary at the front, plain English, so nobody could pretend they didn't understand it. Read the summary first, she coached me. Then go slow. You don't have to win. You just have to be accurate out loud where they can't edit it. We talked through the room. The settlement was set for Graham's house. Dale's idea, home field advantage. All 9 grandchildren and their spouses and Marsh gathered to sign the papers that would close the estate and bury the whole thing for good. They expected a formality, a few signatures, some tears, a casserole done. Marsh, to his credit, had insisted everything be transparent, full accounting on the table, no side rooms. I don't think Dale realized what he was agreeing to when he agreed to that. I practiced one thing and one thing only that last night. Not a speech. My voice. I stood in my kitchen and read the numbers out loud until I could do it flat, even without a tremor, the way you read a recipe. Because I knew that the second I sounded angry, they'd call me bitter, and the truth would get lost in the argument about my tone. Calm was the weapon. Calm was the whole plan. The morning of the meeting, I almost didn't go. I sat in my car in my own driveway with the binder on the passenger seat and felt the full weight of what I was about to do. These were my cousins. Dana remembered my birthday every year. Ryan taught me to ride a bike. Whatever they'd taken, I was about to take something back from them too. The version of their lives where the down payment was a deal and the ring was earned and the marriage was clean. For a minute, the old reflex one, the one that spent my whole life smoothing things over so nobody's upset. I thought, maybe I should just let it go. Then I heard my father's voice, clear as the radio. He taught me to keep books when I was 9 at the same kitchen table where his father's money would later disappear. Numbers don't lie, Tess. He used to say, people do. That's why we write it down. And I understood finally that I wasn't the one breaking this family. The theft broke it. The lie broke it. I was just the one willing to say so with the lights on. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and telling the truth, you know exactly how heavy that binder felt on the seat beside me. Hit subscribe so you're with me when I carry it inside. Because what happened in that kitchen is the reason I'm telling you any of this. I put the car in reverse. I drove to my grandmother's house with the windows down because I wanted to be able to breathe. And I parked behind a line of cars that belonged to people who thought today was the day they finally got me to stop counting. Graham's living room hadn't been that full since the funeral. Folding chairs from the church basement lined the walls. The 9 of us, the spouses, Marsh with his briefcase, and Dale standing at the front like he was about to give a toast. Coffee going around, Sloane in the good chair, watching me come in with a little smile that said she thought I'd lost. Dale opened it exactly the way I expected. He thanked everyone for coming to put Dad to rest financially speaking. He had a stack of documents to sign. The final accounting, the releases, the papers that would close the estate and end any questions forever. Let's keep this simple and respectful, he said. And he looked right at me when he said, respectful. Graham sat in her chair with the quilt and dabbed her eyes at exactly the right moments. A performance so practiced it almost had stage marks. Brett, beside her, played host. Let's keep this about family, he said, not accusations. Marsh cleared his throat and reminded the room mildly that a full accounting was part of the process and that anyone with questions had a right to raise them now. Dale's smile tightened. He hadn't expected the lawyer to hold the door open for me. I let a beat pass. I let them think the silence meant I'd folded. Then I set my binder on the coffee table in the center where everyone could see it. And I said the calmest sentence I have ever said in my life. Before anyone signs anything, I said, "I'd like 5 minutes." I brought the accounting. The room changed pressure. Sloane's smile slipped. Graham stopped dabbing, and Dale, who had run this meeting like a foreman, suddenly looked like a man who'd noticed the floor was wet. I opened the binder to the summary page, and I read it the way Nadine taught me, flat and even, like a recipe. Grandpa's will left each of the 9 of us $1,000. I said $92,000 total. When he died, the estate held $14,000. So I traced the rest. Nobody moved. I turned to the timeline page and laid it on the table facing them. In his last 18 months, $312,000 left his accounts. $222,000 of it went out as cashier checks to people in this room. I started reading. I didn't editorialize. I just gave them the numbers, name by name, the way you read names off a roster. Brett, $45,000. Cut 3 days before your house closed. Brett's mouth opened. I kept going. Ryan, $38,000. The week you proposed. Mia, Ryan's fiancée, turned her head toward him slowly. Kayla, $3,000, routed as consulting payments into Tom's shop the Monday after his final notice. Tom set his coffee down without a sound. Dana, $4,000, 2 days before your clinic invoice. Dana made a sound like the air had been let out of her, and Greg beside her went very still. And then Graham broke right on cue the way I knew she would. "It went to his medicine," she cried, half rising from the chair, the quilt sliding off her knees. "He was sick, you cruel girl." It went to his medicine. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into the binder, pulled the stack of insurance EOS, and laid them next to the timeline, fanned so the column showed. "His insurance paid for his treatment," I said. "Every claim, his out-of-pocket was 0. I let that sit. There was no medicine to buy Graham. There were only their celebrations. The medicine story had lived in this family for 3 months. It died on that coffee table in about 9 seconds, and nobody in the room could look at the place where it had been. Then the room turned on itself, and there was nothing I could do to stop it, because it wasn't mine to stop anymore." Greg stood up. He looked at Dana, and his voice cracked right down the middle. "You said it was a CD." Dana was crying too hard to answer, which was an answer. Across the room, Mia slid the engagement ring off her finger slowly like it had gotten heavy. "The ring," she said to Ryan, not loud, almost gentle. "The down payment, the consulting that was finally taking off. It was all his money. You let me tell people you built that." She set the ring on the side table, and the small click it made was the loudest thing in the room. Tom didn't say anything at all to Kayla. He just stood, picked up his jacket, and walked out the front door. And Kayla went after him, calling his name, and we heard a car start and pull away too fast. Sloane tried. "God love her." She tried to save it. "These were gifts," she said, standing. "Grandparents help their families. That's all this is." But Brett rounded on her, on his own grandmother, on everyone, his whole salesman face gone. "You told me it was clean," he snapped at Graham. "You told me he wanted me to have it." And Graham, surrounded now, the quilt on the floor, the medicine gone, her favorites turning on each other across her own living room, found the only weapon she had left and threw it at me. "You were always the one counting!" she screamed. It hung there, and I gave her the calmest answer I had, the one I'd been holding for 3 months. "Someone had to," I said. He couldn't anymore. I wasn't yelling. I have never once yelled in this story. And that was the point. She was on her feet shaking, the loudest person in the room. And I was sitting down with a binder, and everyone could see exactly who had lost control and who hadn't. Dale made the last stand because foremen always do. He stepped between me and the table. "Hands up. Reasonable." Tessa, these were gifts, he said. A man can give his family his own money. There's no crime here. Let's all calm down. And here is where the boring paperwork did what no shouting ever could. Marsh spoke up from his chair. Quiet, lawyerly, every word chosen. I have to advise the family of something, he said. These transfers happened while Mr. Hill had documented cognitive impairment and while Mrs. Hill controlled the joint accounts. I can't promise any outcome, but under Ohio law, gifts like these can be challenged, and given the medical record and the position of trust, a court could find undue influence and order the funds returned to the estate. He paused. I'll also note that this conduct has already been referred to Adult Protective Services. That referral exists whether or not anyone signs today. Nobody signed anything. Dale looked at the unsigned releases on the table, the ones that were supposed to end this in 20 minutes, and he understood that they were worthless now. Brett sat down hard and put his head in his hands, because $45,000 he didn't have was about to become a debt he did. Graham had gone silent at last, folded back into her chair, looking at the faces of the grandchildren she'd bought, and watching them refuse to look back. I closed my binder. I didn't gloat. There was nothing to gloat about. I was sitting in the wreckage of my own family, and I'd lit the lights myself. But I had not been the cold one. I had been the only one telling the truth in a house that had run on a lie for 18 months. And finally, with the EOBs fanned across the coffee table, every person in that room knew it. It didn't go to a dramatic trial. Those almost never happen, and ours didn't either. It went the slow, unglamorous way real justice usually goes, through lawyers and mediation and a long spreadsheet of who owed what. Faced with the report, the medical records, and the APS referral, the recipients did the math the same way I had. Fighting it in court would cost more than returning it, and they'd likely lose. One by one, they agreed to pay the money back into the estate. It took months, and it was ugly, and there were 3 separate payment plans. But in the end, the $9,000 my grandfather actually intended got reassembled, $1,000 at a time, and the 9 of us each received what the will had promised. Graham repaid her share out of the equity in the house, which is a quiet way of saying she had to borrow against the home she'd schemed to protect. In exchange, and because she was 78 and the family was exhausted, no one pressed for charges. I didn't fight that. I never wanted my grandmother in handcuffs. I wanted the truth on the table and the money back where Walt put it, and I got both. The $14,000 became $90,000 again. It is, I think, the most satisfying ledger I have ever balanced, and the saddest. And I would undo all of it in a heartbeat to have my grandfather back at his kitchen table, logging his Friday chocolate bar. The marriages were the part I never wanted and couldn't prevent. Donna and Greg separated before the leaves turned. He couldn't get past the years of a lie, wearing a CD's clothes. Ryan and Mia called off the wedding. The venue deposit gone. The ring back in a jeweler's case, a whole future quietly canneled because it had been built on a borrowed lie. Kayla and Tom divorced by spring. Tom couldn't run a shop he now knew was kept alive with a dying man's money. Brett and Sloan didn't last either. The $45,000 they had called a gift became a debt owed back to the estate, and a marriage propped up on money that was never theirs came apart under the weight of paying it back. 4 couples walked into my grandmother's kitchen that day. 3 of those marriages and 1 engagement did not survive it. I have made my peace with my part in it, which is to say, I've accepted that I had none. The money came with a lie attached. Lies like that always come due. I just happened to be the one who could read the invoice and refuse to look away from the total. I changed one thing about myself, and it's the change I'm proudest of. I stopped being the family's free bookkeeper. For 33 years, I'd kept everyone's accounts but my own boundaries, and that was over. When my aunt's quilt business needed its taxes sorted, that next winter, I gave her the name of a nice woman who charges by the hour. I see Graham on holidays briefly because she is old, and she is still my grandmother, and I am not built to be cruel. We don't talk about the money. There's no reconciliation in it. No tearful Hallmark scene where she understands. She mostly looks out the window now, but I sleep fine. And that surprised me. The last thing I said to her that mattered, I said in the doorway of that emptied living room. "I'll keep my own books now, Graham," I told her. "Not everyone's." And then I drove home to the apartment that was mine with the binder I would never need to open again. Here's the one thing I keep after all of it. Love that has to be bought was never love. And the truth never broke my family. The lie had already done that quietly for 18 months while a good man forgot what year it was. That's my story. 9 grandchildren, 1 folder, and a number that finally got read out loud. If this made you want to check on an aging parent's accounts or ask one honest question you've been avoiding, take that as your sign and do it today. Share this with someone who needs it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.